It's in this struggle that is the creative process. It is not for nothing.
Welcome to Ostracon, a podcast that translates fragments into the whole from which they came.
Today we're reading The Lee Shore, chapter 23 of Herman Melville's incredible novel, Moby Dick. Maybe at some point in this series we'll be able to talk about the novel in its entirety, but this particular chapter is so extraordinary it's worth its own episode. Herman Melville was born in 1819 and lived until 1891. He was one of 8 children. Though so much of his writing is about the sea, he actually lived and died in New York City, and he's buried in the Bronx. Between 1839 and 1844, he worked on 3 different whale ships and also other sailing vessels, and these formed the basis for much of his writing. Although his family was initially wealthy, which would normally have secured him an officer position on board, they lost their wealth. His father went bankrupt, and so he went to sea as first what they called a green hand, but basically an ordinary sailor. He had a number of adventures along the way, including deserting, spending time on different islands all over the Pacific, actually hunting whales, and serving under captains of various qualifications and capabilities. He was even part of a mutiny. It's worth taking a moment to recall Moby Dick at large and what's happening on the eve of this chapter, so that it's easier to dive in when we read it. As you'll recall, I'm sure, in Moby Dick, the speaker in the book is named Ishmael. He goes out on a whaler with the infamous Captain Ahab, who is bent at all costs to find and destroy a white whale called Moby Dick. And this takes them not only through a season of whaling, but through all types of other trepidation and loss. In chapter 23, Ishmael, the speaker, is in a town called New Bedford, which was one of the whaling centers of the day. And he has gotten himself a place on the Pequod. The Pequod is the ship that the heart of the story of Moby Dick unfolds on. He leaves on the ship on Christmas Day, and he sees there with him a man named Bulkington. Bulkington is someone who he recently met in the town of New Bedford. He had just gotten back from a 4-year sea voyage, and some several days later is back on the Pequod, ready to go out again for months or years. So he is shocked to see him there, and this leads to a reflection on the temperament of this person, and perhaps all of us, not sitting still but flying on, and why. As we interpret this chapter, it's also necessary to have a quick lesson in sailing. The terms windward and leeward, that's spelled Leeward, but it's not leeward, it's leeward. Windward means in the direction the wind is coming from. Leeward means in the direction the wind is going. The chapter here is called The Lee Shore. That means that if you were standing on the boat, the shore is on the leeward side. In other words, the shore is in the direction the wind is blowing from the perspective of the ship. This has kind of a double meaning, because the leeward side is usually the protected side, like the leeward side of an island is the downwind side of an island, so it's usually drier and more protected, but not from the perspective of the ship. On the ship, when you look to a lee shore, you look to the leeward side of the ship, but you look to a shore that the wind is blowing down upon. So from the ship, the lee shore is a shore that has the wind hitting it full force, and that can make it a dangerous place for a ship, because in wind and weather, the wind is pushing it towards the ground. So now that we have the context of the book and the meaning of the nautical terms, let's read the lee shore, and then we'll think about it. Chapter 23, The Lee Shore. Some chapters back, one Bulkington was spoken of, a tall, new-landed mariner encountered in New Bedford at the inn. When on that shivering winter's night, the Pequod thrust her vindictive bows into the cold, malicious waves, who should I see standing at her helm but Bulkington? I looked with sympathetic awe and fearfulness upon the man, who in midwinter just landed from a 4 years' dangerous voyage, could so unresistingly push off again for still another tempestuous term. The land seemed scorching to his feet. Wonderfulest things are ever the unmentionable. Deep memories yield no epitaphs. This 6-inch chapter is the stoneless grave of Bulkington. Let me only say that it fared with him as with the storm-tossed ship that miserably drives along the leeward land. The port would fain give succor. The port is pitiful. In the port is safety, comfort, hearthstone, supper, warm blankets, friends, all that's kind to our mortalities. But in that gale, the port, the land, is that ship's direst jeopardy. She must fly all hospitality. One touch of land, though it but graze the keel, would make her shudder through and through. With all her might, she crowds all sail offshore. In so doing, fights 'gainst the very winds that fain would blow her homeward. Seeks all the lashed sea's landlessness again, for refuge's sake, forlornly rushing into peril, her only friend, her bitterest foe. Know ye now, Bulkington, glimpses do ye seem to see of that mortally intolerable truth that all deep, earnest thinking is but the intrepid effort of the soul to keep the open independence of her sea, while the wildest winds of heaven and earth conspire to cast her on the treacherous, slavish shore. But as in landlessness alone resides the highest truth, shoreless, indefinite as God, so better it is to perish in that howling infinite than be ingloriously dashed upon the lee, even if that were safety. For worm-like then, oh, who would craven crawl to land? Terrors of the terrible! Is all this agony so vain? Take heart, O Bulkington. Bear thee grimly, demigod, up from the spray of thy ocean perishing, straight up leaps thy apotheosis. So what is happening here? Two things. First, you have the situation of the ship, and then you have that situation mapped onto the individual. So what is the situation of the ship? It's in the storm. It's tossed. It's driving along the leeward land. In other words, the land with the wind upon it. In the port is everything that would be comfortable. Everything that's kind to our mortalities, he said. Warmth, something to eat, safety. And to reach it is danger. Because of the ship's situation to the land and the wind in the storm, if it were to go to port, it would risk being sunk. And therefore, for the sake of its preservation, it must stay in the storm. Fly all hospitality, it says. One touch of land, though it but graze the keel, would make her shudder through and through. So the ship must stay offshore in the storm and fight against the very winds that would take her homeward. Seeks all the lashed sea's landlessness again, for refuge's sake, forlornly rushing into peril, her only friend, her bitterest foe. While the wind at the right place and time might be able to get the ship home, and in that sense would be a friend, now it is not. Now it presents danger. Though the ship can move because of the wind, it's a sailing vessel. It's the wind that causes it to move on the waters. And so they have a relationship to one another. The wind gives the ship this power, but the wind also can destroy the ship by driving it upon the land. So there's a couple of ways that we can read this. First, it's good to want to be home. It's good to be safe, but the ship can't get there now. It's good to want heaven, paradise, eternity, peace, but it may be that we can't get there now. Now we're in the storm. Now we use our talent, our strength, our knowledge to fight and to persevere in the storm. Another way that you could read it is, as Khalil Gibran says, the poet, who I hope we can talk about in this series also, the love of comfort slays the passion of the soul. Because the harbor there that they're looking to with longing is not, in fact, paradise. It is just an earthly harbor, which is good insofar as what it is, but it's not final. There's a danger in wanting comfort beyond wanting to strive. Just as the ship is at risk of being run aground and sinking by going to comfort, so the love of comfort above other things, even to the point of forsaking the struggle, can be soul-killing. We're made to strive. We're made to contend. We're made to use the talents and the strength and the intelligence and the unique things that are given to us in order to contend for the good. We have to be in the fight. That's the place where we are now. And it's like the ancient Greek sirens just being lured into a place of pleasure where time passes imperceptibly, and then the end is here, and what has been accomplished. The end like a thief in the night. It reminds me of Jacob, who wrestles all night with an angel and is hurt while wrestling, and he's given the name Israel, which means to strive with or to contend with God. So the condition of the ship is our condition. We're out here fighting the winds, fighting the storm, and we must go on because we cannot risk giving up. We can say more, too, about the ship's relationship with the wind. The wind is what lets the ship move, but it's also what can endanger the ship if the ship doesn't steer the right way, if it doesn't know what to do with the wind or where to go. So not only is there a relationship to the struggle and to comfort and to safety, but there's also a relationship to our own abilities. They are the thing that allows us to contend. They're what permits the ship to persevere in the storm. But You still have to use them correctly. Judgment still has to be made as to where to steer. What way lies danger? What way lies perseverance? Now, we move to the second part of the chapter. Know ye now, Balkington. He's directly asking the reader with a question. Do you see yourself in this? Glimpses do ye seem to see of that mortally intolerable truth, that all deep earnest thinking is but the intrepid effort of the soul to keep the open independence of her sea? Yes, the independence is in the sea, in the fight, in the storm, of not laying over to comfort and pleasure, but of contending with the challenges of life, while the wildest winds of heaven and earth conspire to cast her on that treacherous, slavish shore. Yes, it sounds strange when you read it first, because the shore is brought up as the place of comfort, hearthstone, supper. Why is it treacherous and slavish? Treacherous because of the danger of loss of self in giving up the fight. Slavish because while we contend with the storm, we are in our independence as full persons exercising our capability. If all we want is the comfort and the pleasure, then the risk is that it does make slaves of us. In landlessness alone resides the highest truth, shoreless. Yes, he sees in this fight a realization of the self, that we are not our fullest selves when we are slaves to comfort. We are our fullest selves when we are out there contending. It's in that landlessness that resides the highest truth, in other words, our actual identity. Better it is to perish in that howling infinite than be ingloriously dashed upon the lee, even if that were safety. Yes, because if you have gone for safety and lost yourself and your identity, then it is inglorious. It is better to contend in the howling infinite. It suggests the line, what good does it do to gain the whole world and lose your soul? Worm-like, then who would craven crawl to land? But he ends with a question, and he responds to his own question. He says, almost exasperatedly, is all this agony so vain? Is all this agony so useless? Is all of this unnecessary suffering? When the port is there, we can see it, and we're kept out of it. But the whole meaning of this chapter answers the question that no, it's not vain. We're out here finding and making ourselves with and through the grace of God. It's in this struggle that is the creative process. It is not for nothing. And he answers the question, take heart, O Balkington. He might as well be saying, take heart, reader. Bear thee grimly, demigod. Straight up from the spray of thy ocean perishing leaps thy apotheosis. Apotheosis meaning high point or climax. In the U.S. Capitol Dome, there's a painting of Washington sort of glorified, called the Apotheosis of Washington, looking down from the dome. The term apotheosis actually comes from Greek, meaning to make a god of. And here you get to something even deeper. The teaching of the church fathers that in Christ God became man, that man might become God. That's Athanasius. That we are called to the divine, that the experience of heaven is a divinization. But we don't get there longing for the port of comfort. We get there in the struggle. Christ went to the cross. He says, take up your cross and follow me. This is where, with his cooperation and strength we make ourself. So he says, take heart. Up from the spray of thy ocean perishing, straight up leaps thy apotheosis. In this struggle is the path to the actual harbor, the one that you are really longing for, the one that is not slavish comfort, but a path to heaven.